My husband changed the locks while I was at the doctor. I came home to find my suitcases on the street. I just laughed out loud. Good luck, darling. He had no idea the house was actually in my name only. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that hindsight is 20/20, and Lord, were they right. I'm Marjorie Haywood. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same house on Clover Hill Road in Millbrook, Tennessee, for nearly my entire adult life. My parents built that house in 1961. My father poured the concrete of the front steps with his own hands. My mother planted the dogwood tree in the backyard that still blooms every April without fail, reliable as sunrise, reliable as grief. When they passed, Mama in 2004, Daddy 2 years later, they left the house to me. Not to me and my husband, to me, Marjorie Ann Haywood, Nick Ellaway. That distinction, which once seemed like a mere legal formality, would become the most important fact of my life. I met Randy Haywood at a church picnic in 1981. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, effortlessly, almost carelessly, like a man who has never had to try very hard because the world has always smiled on him. He had a good laugh, a firm handshake, and a way of making you feel like the only person in the room. We married within a year. I won't say it was a mistake from the start, because it wasn't. We had 37 years that contained real things. A daughter named Caroline, Sunday dinners, a garden I was proud of, arguments about nothing that dissolved by morning. I don't believe in rewriting the past just because it ended badly. But marriages change, people change, or perhaps they simply stop pretending. The first thing I noticed, and dismissed as women of my generation are trained to do, was the phone. Randy had always been the kind of man who left his cell phone on the kitchen counter, face up, unconcerned. Around the spring of 2022, the phone disappeared into his pocket. Always. Even when he was just moving from the living room to the garage, I told myself he'd read an article about electromagnetic fields. I told myself a lot of things. Then came the late evenings. Randy had been retired for 6 years, and retirement had suited him. Early dinners, the news at 7, asleep by 10. But suddenly, he was meeting the guys from the lodge on Tuesday nights, coming home past 11 smelling of cologne I didn't recognize. Not alcohol. Cologne. There's something particularly insulting about a man who bothers to put on cologne for someone else. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I watched. By August, I had noticed that he'd begun taking an unusual interest in my filing cabinet. The one in the small office off the hallway, where I kept the house documents, insurance papers, Mama and Daddy's estate records. I'd come home one afternoon to find the drawer slightly open and a folder turned the wrong way. Randy knew I kept everything in order. He'd teased me about it for decades. So why would he go through those files? I said nothing. I started photographing the contents of that cabinet every time I left the house. September came, and with it, a feeling I cannot fully describe. A low, cold certainty, like knowing a storm is coming, not because you've checked the forecast, but because your bones ache. I began paying attention to small things. A receipt for dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never been to. A charge on our joint account for a hotel 40 miles away. Nothing dramatic, nothing a lawyer could immediately use. Just a quiet, accumulating dread. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday in October. I had a routine appointment with my cardiologist. Just a checkup, nothing serious. I drove myself, as I always did. The appointment took longer than expected. Doctor, Okafor wanted to adjust my medication, and we talked for nearly an hour. By the time I pulled back onto Clover Hill Road, the afternoon light was already thinning. I saw the suitcases first. 3 of them, lined up on the front porch like soldiers. My suitcases. The set my daughter Caroline had given me for my 65th birthday. Navy blue with the little gold clasps. Beside them, 2 cardboard boxes stuffed with what appeared to be my clothes, my books, my bathroom things. The front door was closed. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out. I walked to the door and tried my key. It didn't turn. I stood there on the porch of the house my father had built, in front of the dogwood tree my mother had planted, and I understood exactly what had happened. Randy had changed the locks while I was at the doctor. He had packed my belongings. He had decided that this was over, and that he would be the one to decide the terms. The door opened. Randy stood in the frame, and behind him, barely visible in the hallway shadows, was a woman I recognized vaguely from town. Younger than me by at least 20 years. Her name, I would later learn, was Tammy Briggs. Randy crossed his arms and said, with a steadiness that told me he'd rehearsed this, "Marjorie, I think it's time we go our separate ways. I've packed your things. I'd like you to leave." I looked at him. I looked at the woman behind him. I looked at the suitcases my daughter had given me. And I laughed. Not a broken laugh, not a hysterical one. A clear, full laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and certain. "Good luck, sweetheart," I said. He didn't know. He truly did not know. That the house he was standing in, the house he was locking me out of, was not his. It had never been his. And what he'd done today in front of a witness would cost him everything. But that understanding would come to him slowly. I intended to make sure of that. I didn't sleep that night in the house on Clover Hill Road because I wasn't in it. I drove to Caroline's. My daughter lives 20 minutes away, in a small brick house she shares with her husband, Tom, and their 2 teenagers. She met me at the door in her bathrobe. I'd called from the car, and when she saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just held the door open wide. That's the kind of woman I raised, and in that moment I was more grateful for it than I can say. I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, and I told her everything. Not in a rush, not in tears, but methodically, the way I had always approached problems that mattered. Caroline listened without interrupting, which cost her something. I could see it in the way she pressed her lips together. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said carefully, "does Randy know whose name is on the deed?" "I don't know what he knows," I said, "but I know what the deed says." That was the first time I felt it. Not fear exactly, but a sharp, clarifying anger. The kind that doesn't make you reckless. The kind that makes you very, very careful. I lay in Caroline's guest room that night, and I did not cry. What I did instead was think. I ran through everything I knew. The facts, the timeline, the assets, the papers. Randy and I had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. The house was mine, recorded in my name alone, inherited from my parents. Randy's name had never been added to the deed, a fact he had apparently not investigated as thoroughly as he should have before locking me out of it. We had no prenuptial agreement. Tennessee was not a community property state, but it did recognize marital contribution to assets, a distinction I intended to understand completely before I did anything else. What had I lost? I tallied it like a ledger. I had lost access to my home. Temporarily, I had lost, or Randy had tried to take, my sense of security, my dignity, my daily life. I noted that. What did I still have? Quite a lot, as it turned out. I had the deed to the house. I had a daughter who believed me. I had 43 years of careful living that had taught me not to act before I understood the ground beneath my feet. and I had the photographs I'd taken of the filing cabinet contents, stored safely in the cloud, backed up twice, because my grandson had taught me how to do that the previous Christmas. In the morning, I borrowed Caroline's computer and I wrote a list. First, I needed an attorney, not a general practitioner, a family law attorney with experience in property disputes and marital asset division in Tennessee. I asked Caroline's neighbor, Linda, who had been through a divorce 5 years ago, for a recommendation. She gave me a name without hesitating: Ellen Marsh, downtown Millbrook, second floor above the insurance office. Second, I needed to understand the extent of the financial damage. Randy had access to our joint accounts. I needed to know immediately what he had or hadn't already moved. I called the bank from Caroline's kitchen, my account, my right, and learned that 2 days prior, Randy had transferred $8,000 from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. I wrote that number down. I wrote everything down. Third, I needed documentation of what had happened the previous afternoon. The locked door, the suitcases on the porch, the woman standing behind him in my hallway. I had taken 3 photographs from the car before I'd gotten out. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. Pure instinct. And those photographs showed the suitcases, the porch, and the timestamp. I uploaded them alongside the cabinet photos. Fourth, I would not contact Randy directly. Not yet. Every instinct I had told me that the moment I picked up the phone and argued with him, I would give him information I didn't want him to have, about what I knew, what I planned, what I felt. Silence, I had learned over 68 years, is often the most powerful language available. The plan that emerged over those 48 hours at Caroline's was not complicated. Complexity, in my experience, is the enemy of execution. The plan was simple: establish my legal position, document everything, move swiftly, and let the law do what the law was designed to do. Randy had made a significant error. He had acted dramatically, emotionally, without consulting a lawyer, which told me he didn't fully understand his legal exposure. That was his disadvantage. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Caroline offered to confront him herself. "No," I said. "Mom, he threw you out of your own house." "I know what he did, and confronting him before I'm ready would warn him. Right now, the best thing you can do is let me handle this the right way." She didn't like it, but she trusted me. And trust between a mother and daughter is its own kind of power. I called Ellen Marsh's office that same afternoon. The receptionist said the earliest appointment was in 4 days. I said I needed something sooner. I explained, briefly and factually, what had happened. There was a pause. "Can you come in tomorrow at 8:30? The receptionist said. I said yes. That evening, sitting in Caroline's guest room with my legal pad and my borrowed reading glasses, I felt the fear, really felt it, beneath all the planning, cold and real. I was 68 years old. I had lived in that house for decades. My mother's china was in that kitchen. My father's handwriting was on the wall of the pantry where he'd marked my height as a child. The idea that a man I had fed and washed and stood beside at funerals, had decided he could simply remove me from my own life like an outdated piece of furniture was not just legally wrong. It was the kind of wrong that doesn't leave you unchanged. I folded the fear up and put it somewhere it could be useful. Then I went back to my list. Ellen Marsh's office smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, which I found reassuring. Some environments tell you immediately whether you're in capable hands. Ellen herself was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the unhurried manner of a woman who has seen everything and remains surprised by nothing. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. All of it. I put my legal pad on her desk, the photographs on her desk, the bank notification on her desk. I had learned from years of dealing with contractors and insurance companies and school administrators that the person who comes in organized gets taken more seriously than the person who comes in upset. Upset is understandable. Organized is powerful. When I finished, Ellen was quiet for a moment. She looked at the deed, the copy I'd retrieved from my photographs of the filing cabinet. And then she looked at me. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, "your husband changed the locks on a house that is legally your sole property. He is currently occupying it without your permission, along with a third party you did not authorize to be there. In Tennessee, that constitutes unlawful detainer. We can file an emergency petition." I asked her to explain what that meant in plain terms. "It means," she said, "that a judge can order him out within days, not weeks, days. The fact that you've been married doesn't give him title to a property that was inherited solely by you and remains in your name." Tennessee Code, Section 66-6-101 is very clear. Your name is on that deed. His is not. He has no legal right to be there without your consent. And based on what you've described, he is there with the explicit intent of excluding you. That's actionable. I felt something shift in my chest. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter. Confirmation. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Ellen outlined the divorce proceedings, which I had already decided were inevitable, alongside the property recovery. She explained the $8,000 transfer, which could constitute dissipation of marital assets, a term that carried real legal weight. She told me what to document, what not to say, and what to expect. She was honest about the emotional cost, which I appreciated more than false comfort. When I left her office, I sat in my car in the small parking lot behind the building and looked at the ordinary street beyond. A hardware store, a dry cleaner, a woman pushing a stroller. And I thought, he did not expect this. He thought I would panic. He thought I would call him, crying, and beg to come home. He thought this was over. He had 48 years of knowing me, and he still did not know me at all. Ellen filed the emergency petition that afternoon. What I didn't anticipate, what I should have anticipated, was that Randy had apparently begun to sense something had shifted. Perhaps it was the silence. He'd expected calls and had received none. He'd expected tears and had received nothing. By Thursday, 3 days after the lockout, Carolyn told me he had driven past her house twice in one afternoon. She'd seen him slow down, look at the windows, and drive on. "He's nervous," Caroline said. "Good," I said. But Tammy Briggs, I would discover, was not a stupid woman. She was calculating in the way that people are calculating when they have something specific to gain. And she had been calculating for longer than I knew. That same Thursday, my friend Dolores, who has known me for 30 years and sees everything that happens in a 3-mile radius of Millbrook, called to tell me she'd seen Tammy at the county courthouse that morning, not in the clerk's office, standing outside the property records window. Tammy had been looking up the deed. I called Ellen immediately. "She knows," I said. "Good," Ellen said. "Let her look. The deed is public record. It doesn't change what it says." But it told me something crucial. They were no longer operating from assumption. They now knew, or Tammy knew and would tell Randy, that the house was mine, which meant the dynamic had shifted. They had made their move in ignorance, and now they were scrambling to understand what they'd walked into. The direct evidence I had been missing came not from a private investigator or a court document, but from something far more mundane, a forwarded email. Randy, in a lapse of judgment that I can only attribute to overconfidence, had sent a message to Tammy from our shared family email account, the one we'd used for years for household things, subscriptions, medical appointment reminders. He had forgotten, apparently, that I had set up that account and still had full access to it. The message, dated 6 weeks before he changed the locks, laid out a plan with a clarity that made me sit down heavily in Caroline's kitchen chair. He had written, and I am paraphrasing because the words are not mine to reproduce, that once I was out of the picture, Tammy could move in immediately, that he intended to claim the house as a marital asset in the divorce, that he had consulted someone, not a lawyer, it emerged, a friend with opinions, who told him that long-term marriage gave him rights to the property regardless of whose name was on it. He had written that he expected me to be too frightened and too old to fight properly. Too old. I read that phrase twice. Then I forwarded the email to Ellen Marsh. That, Ellen said when she called me back, is exactly what we needed. I hung up the phone and looked out Caroline's kitchen window at the ordinary afternoon. The neighbor's dog, the school bus turning the corner, the leaves coming off the oak tree in the yard. And I understood that we had reached a point from which there was no return. Not for me, and certainly not for Randy. The court date for the emergency petition was set for the following Tuesday. In the 5 days between filing and hearing, I kept myself occupied the way I have always kept myself occupied during difficult periods, with methodical action and very little self-pity. Ellen had advised me not to go to the house. I didn't need to be told twice. Clover Hill Road would wait. In the meantime, I worked with her to compile everything: the deed, the email, the bank records showing the $8,000 transfer, the photographs from the day of the lockout, and a written timeline. I prepared myself, dated and specific, covering 6 months of what I had observed. I am not a lawyer, but I know how to write clearly, and I know the value of dates and specifics. And Ellen told me the timeline was one of the most useful client documents she'd received in years. On Saturday, 4 days after the filing, my phone rang. Randy's name on the screen. I let it ring. He called twice more within the hour. Then, just before noon, a text arrived. "Marjorie, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Call me." I photographed the text and sent it to Ellen. I did not respond. By Sunday afternoon, the strategy changed. Randy and Tammy drove to Caroline's house. I saw them from the upstairs window. Randy's truck in the driveway, Randy getting out, Tammy staying in the passenger seat, visible, deliberate, like a statement. Caroline, to her enormous credit, went to the door before I could stop her. I came downstairs. Randy looked different than I expected. Not triumphant, as I'd imagined he might look when I first saw those suitcases. He looked tight around the jaw, controlled, but barely. "Marjorie," he said, "this lawyer business is unnecessary. You're making this ugly." "You changed the locks," I said. "I want a clean split, that's all. We sign some papers, we go our separate ways, no courts involved." "And the house?" I asked. Something passed over his face. He'd spoken to someone, a lawyer, finally, and the conversation had not gone the way he'd hoped. I could see it. "We can negotiate the house," he said carefully. "There's nothing to negotiate, Randy. The house is mine." That's when Tammy got out of the truck. She walked up the driveway with the measured confidence of someone who has prepared what she intends to say. She was dressed neatly, carefully, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, "I think if we all calm down—" "You're on my daughter's property," I said. "You weren't invited." Tammy's expression didn't change immediately, but something behind her eyes did. She looked at Randy. He was looking at the ground. Then her tone shifted. The sympathy dropped away like a coat she'd decided was too warm. You think a piece of paper is going to protect you? She said quietly. Randy's been in that marriage for decades. Courts don't ignore that. You'd better think carefully about what kind of fight you want. There it was, the threat they'd been building toward. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, I've already thought carefully. My attorney filed an emergency petition 4 days ago. The hearing is Tuesday. I'd suggest Randy speak to his lawyer before then. The silence that followed was the kind you can feel. Randy grabbed Tammy's arm, gently but firmly, and steered her back toward the truck. He turned once at the end of the driveway. You're making a mistake, he said. Randy, I said, you wrote an email about me 6 weeks ago. I have it. He got in the truck. They left. Caroline stood beside me on the porch, and we watched the truck disappear around the corner. My heart was beating hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. There's something viscerally unpleasant about being threatened on your daughter's porch by a woman your husband brought to replace you. I felt it. But I also felt the specific clarity that comes from having the truth in your corner. Tuesday's hearing was brief, as emergency hearings often are. Randy arrived with an attorney he'd clearly retained in a hurry, a general practitioner, competent, but unprepared for what Ellen had assembled. The judge, a careful woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Rowe, reviewed the deed, the emergency petition, the photograph evidence, and the unlawful detainer filing. She asked Randy's attorney 2 questions. His attorney answered both inadequately. Judge Rowe ordered Randy and any occupants to vacate the property at 14 Clover Hill Road within 72 hours and return all keys to the plaintiff, that was me, forthwith. She also issued a temporary freeze on the joint financial accounts pending the divorce proceedings. Randy went pale. I didn't smile. I simply wrote down the order number in my legal pad and thanked Ellen quietly. That evening, I allowed myself something I had not allowed since the lockout. I did nothing. I sat in Caroline's backyard in the October dusk, in a lawn chair with a quilt over my knees, and I let the events of the past 2 weeks simply exist without requiring anything from me. Caroline brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me without speaking, which was exactly right. I was not unharmed. Let me be honest about that. What Randy had done, the betrayal of it, the contempt of it, the cold efficiency of having packed my things while I was at the cardiologist, had left marks that wouldn't heal quickly. But I had done what needed to be done. And in 3 days, I was going home. Randy vacated the house on the 3rd day. Not the 1st, not the 2nd, but precisely at the deadline, which told me he'd consulted his new lawyer thoroughly and understood that violating the court order would make everything significantly worse for him. He left quietly. No drama, no phone calls. Just gone. I drove to Clover Hill Road alone that Friday morning. I sat in the car for a moment before going in, the way you sometimes pause before entering a place you love after a long absence, wanting to hold the anticipation just a little longer. Then I took out the new key Ellen had arranged. The locksmith had come the day after the court order, accompanied by Caroline and Tom, and I unlocked the front door of my house. He had not damaged anything. That surprised me, I'll admit. The furniture was where it had always been. The kitchen was in order, if unfamiliar in the small way that a space becomes unfamiliar when someone else has been living in it. My mother's china was intact. My father's height markings were still on the pantry wall. What was missing were his things, his clothes, his tools, the fishing gear that had lived in the garage for 30 years. He had taken what was his and left what was mine. And there was something in that that felt less like dignity and more like retreat. I opened every window in the house, let the October air move through. I was home. The first attempt at what I can only call temptation came 4 days after my return. Randy sent a card. Not an email, not a text. A physical card. The kind from the drugstore, with a painted autumn scene on the front. Inside, in his handwriting, he had written that he was sorry for how things had happened, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he hoped we could settle the divorce quietly and fairly without the courts involved. He mentioned, as if in passing, that the house might be something we could discuss privately, just the two of us, outside the legal process. I read the card twice. I recognized what it was. It wasn't remorse. It was strategy. His lawyer had told him that the email, the one in which he'd written that he expected me to be too frightened and too old to fight, was damaging, and that the wisest course was now to soften me, to suggest we could negotiate outside the courtroom where that email would be less powerful. He was trying to get me to the table before discovery could proceed. I gave the card to Ellen. "Hold on to it," she said. "It establishes that he's aware of potential liability." What Randy didn't understand, couldn't understand perhaps because he had spent decades watching me manage and accommodate and keep the peace, was that I had no interest in a quiet settlement that protected him. I had interest in a fair resolution, and fair and quiet are not always the same thing. Was I tempted? I want to be honest. There was a moment, holding that card with its painted autumn leaves, when I felt the pull of the life that had been 37 years of something that had contained real love, even if love had drained out of it by the end. The temptation wasn't to forgive him. It was simpler and more dangerous than that. It was the temptation to be done, to skip to the end, to take whatever he offered just to stop feeling the weight of it. I put the card in the folder with the email and the bank statements. That's where it belonged. The support I found in those weeks was something I hadn't expected, or hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. I had always been self-sufficient in a way that sometimes kept people at a careful distance, and I had taken a kind of quiet pride in that. But isolation, I discovered, is only manageable until the stakes become real. Once they became real, I needed people. And people, to my genuine surprise, were there. Dolores came every Tuesday with food and conversation, and the particular gift she has of talking about everything and nothing, filling the silence without demanding anything from it. My neighbor, Helen, who I had known for 23 years without knowing well, appeared at my door one Saturday morning with a casserole and the information that she had, herself, gone through something similar in 1997, and that she had come out the other side, and that I would too. Caroline called every morning at 8, just to check in. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes for 3 minutes, but the call always came. And then there was the women's group at First Methodist, a group I had attended sporadically for years without fully belonging to. I went on a Wednesday evening, 6 days after returning to the house, and I told them what had happened. Not everything, not the legal details, but enough. The room was quiet when I finished. And then a woman named Ruth, who is 81 and has buried 2 husbands, reached across and put her hand over mine and said, "You did the right thing, and you'll keep doing the right thing. We'll be here." I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Randy, I knew, was watching. Caroline reported that he'd called twice, not to her, but to Tom, trying to take the temperature of the situation through a side channel. Tammy had been seen again near the county courthouse. Their surveillance of me was clumsy and obvious, the kind of watching that people do when they're afraid, not when they're confident. Let them watch. I had nothing to hide and everything to prove. They came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after I'd returned to the house. I saw the truck from the kitchen window while I was making coffee. and I had exactly enough time to set my cup down before the doorbell rang. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, my kitchen, with my mother's copper pot on the stove and my father's marks on the pantry door. And I breathed. Then I went to the door. They were both on the porch. Randy was holding a small paper bag. From the bakery on Elm Street, I noticed, which had been our bakery for 30 years, where we had bought coffee cake after church on Sunday mornings for longer than I could remember. The choice of the bag was not accidental. Tammy stood slightly behind him, dressed carefully, hands folded. She had the look of someone who has prepared a role and is committed to performing it. "Morning, Marjorie," Randy said. He had his soft voice on, the one I remembered from arguments in earlier years when he wanted to de-escalate. "We just thought we'd come by. Talk, maybe. Nothing formal." I stepped out onto the porch rather than invite them in. My house, my terms. "All right," I said. Tammy spoke first, which surprised me. "Mrs. Haywood, I want to apologize for the way things happened. I didn't want it to go the way it did." She met my eyes when she said it, which I gave her partial credit for, while also noticing that she was apologizing for the method and not the fact. A careful apology, a lawyer's apology. "I appreciate that," I said, in a tone that indicated nothing. Randy set the bakery bag on the porch railing. "Marjorie," he said, and his voice shifted. Lower, older, something in it reaching back across 37 years. "We had something real. I know that. And I'm not asking to go back. I'm just asking if we can end this without destroying each other. You know what legal proceedings do to a family. Caroline is in the middle of this. The grandkids. There's no reason for it to go that far." There it was. The children, the grandchildren, the family. He was not wrong that court proceedings are hard on families. That was true. But he was using that truth as a tool, and I heard the difference. "Randy," I said, "what exactly are you proposing?" He had clearly prepared for this moment. He proposed, in organized terms that his lawyer had almost certainly helped him construct, a mediated settlement outside of court. He would relinquish any claim to the house in exchange for a more favorable division of the liquid marital assets, the joint accounts, a small investment account I'd built over 20 years of careful saving. He framed it as fairness. He framed it as mercy. What he was proposing, in plain terms, was that I trade away the financial security of my retirement in exchange for keeping a house that was already legally mine. I looked at him. I looked at Tammy. I thought of the email, too frightened and too old to fight properly. "I have an attorney," I said. "All proposals go through her." Something shifted in Tammy. She had been performing patience, but patience, for certain people, is finite. "Mrs. Haywood," she said, and the careful tone was mostly gone now. "You are 78 years old." "68, I said. She continued, without pausing. "And this process is going to be long and expensive and hard on your health. Is that really what you want? Because Randy is prepared to be reasonable. But if you insist on going through the courts, we will contest the inheritance claim. We'll argue marital contribution. We'll make the case that decades of marriage created equity in this property, and we will drag this out for as long as it takes." I listened to all of it. Then I said quietly, "Are you finished?" She blinked. "You drove to my house on a Saturday morning with a bakery bag and a speech," I said. "That tells me you're worried. If your legal position were strong, you wouldn't be here. You'd be in court." I picked up the bakery bag and held it out to Randy. "Thank you for coming by." Randy took the bag. His jaw was tight. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Possibly," I said, "but not for the reason you think." They left. I went inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular expenditure of holding yourself completely steady when everything in you wants to react. I sat down in the armchair in the living room, the one that had been my mother's. The fear was real. I want to be clear about that. Tammy's threat, the promise to contest, to drag it out, to fight every inch, was not empty. Court proceedings are expensive. They are exhausting. I was 68 years old, alone, with a heart condition that required monitoring, and she had known exactly where to aim when she mentioned my health. But the fear had an interesting quality. Instead of freezing me, it clarified me. It laid out exactly what was at stake in precise, unflinching terms. And once I could see the stakes, that clearly the path forward was not less certain. It was more. I called Ellen Monday morning and told her everything. She listened carefully. "They're bluffing about the inheritance claim," she said. "Tennessee courts have been very consistent on inherited property and sole ownership. Their case there is weak. But the marital contribution argument, that's where they'd put their energy. We need to be ready for it." "Then let's be ready for it," I said. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in December, 7 weeks after the lockout. December in Millbrook is gray and cold, the trees stripped bare, everything visible. I have always thought that winter is the most honest season. There is nowhere to hide. Walking into the Rutherford County Courthouse that morning, I thought that was appropriate. Ellen and I had prepared for 6 weeks. We had the deed, the email, the bank records, the photographs, the timeline, and 2 additional pieces of documentation that Ellen had obtained through discovery. Randy's bank statements for the 18 months prior to the lockout and his phone records from the same period. The bank statements revealed not 1, but 4 transfers to accounts linked to Tammy Briggs. Small enough individually not to alarm an inattentive spouse, large enough in aggregate to constitute, in Ellen's precise language, a pattern of intentional financial diversion from marital assets. The total across 18 months, $22,000. Randy's attorney, a more experienced man than the one he'd brought to the emergency hearing, someone named Walters, who wore good suits and had the careful manner of a professional who has learned to expect surprises, had presumably reviewed the same documents. He looked, when I saw him in the hallway outside the courtroom, like a man who had stayed up late. Tammy was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she was present in the gallery as a witness for Randy's side, there to testify about their relationship and its timeline. I had expected that. What I had not known, but Ellen had learned through a deposition 2 weeks prior, was that Tammy had her own financial exposure. One of the 4 transfers had come from a home equity line of credit that Randy had quietly opened against a jointly owned storage property in both our names. He had not obtained my signature because he had forged it. That discovery, late in the preparation, had taken my breath away. I had sat in Ellen's office and simply looked at the paper for a long moment. 37 years. And somewhere in there, he had forged my signature on a legal document. Ellen had referred that specific matter to the district attorney's office. There were now 2 proceedings, not 1. Judge Rowe presided again, the same careful woman from the emergency hearing. Randy and Walters sat across the aisle. I sat with Ellen, my legal pad on my knee, my hands still. The hearing opened with the property issue. Walters argued the marital contribution doctrine competently. He was a skilled attorney, making the case that decades of shared life created an equitable interest in the property, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Ellen responded with the specific Tennessee precedents, the nature of the inheritance, the fact that Randy's name had been offered and declined at the time of the estate transfer. A detail confirmed by a surviving note from my parents' estate attorney, whom Ellen had tracked down and deposed. When Walters rested his argument, Judge Rowe asked Randy 2 questions directly. That was the first crack. "Mr. Haywood," she said, "were you aware, at the time of your marriage, that the property at 14 Clover Hill Road was held solely in your wife's name?" Randy hesitated. "I understood it was a family property." "Were you aware," the judge repeated with the patience of someone who has learned not to accept non-answers, "that your name was not on the deed?" "I assumed." "Thank you." The second crack came during the financial portion. Ellen presented the bank records. She presented the transfers to Tammy's accounts. She presented the equity line of credit, and then, measured and factual, informed the court that the district attorney's office had opened an inquiry into the signature on that document. The room was very quiet. Walters asked for a recess. Judge Rowe allowed 10 minutes. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and watched the winter light come through the tall windows. Ellen sat beside me, reviewing notes. From the direction of the small conference room at the end of the hall, I could hear raised voices. Randy's and Walters's, one controlled and one not. I did not try to make out the words. When we returned to the courtroom, Randy was different. The controlled, prepared demeanor of the morning had developed fractures. He was pale. He sat too still. The stillness of a man trying very hard not to show that something has gone badly wrong. Tammy, in the gallery, was white. She took the stand when called. Ellen's cross-examination was methodical and unhurried, the way a careful surgeon works, not the way a theatrical attorney works. Question by question, Tammy's account of the timeline of her relationship with Randy diverged from the phone records. Small inconsistencies, each one minor, each one documented. The account she had prepared and that their relationship had begun after Randy and I had already separated was dismantled date by date. At one point, Tammy looked directly at Randy from the stand. It was not a loving look. Randy, for his part, had stopped taking notes. His pen was on the table. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, and he had the expression of a man who has played a hand of cards and watched, card by card, as his hand turned out to be much weaker than he had believed. Was I glad? I'm not sure that's the right word. There is a kind of satisfaction in the truth being documented, official, on the record. Not a happy satisfaction, but a just one. The kind that feels like the world briefly working the way it is supposed to work. Judge Rowe took a 20-minute recess to review the morning's material. When she returned, she did not make me wait. Judge Rowe's ruling, when it came, was 23 pages. I know because Ellen sent me a copy that afternoon, and I read every page that evening at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my reading glasses. I will summarize what the court found. On the matter of the property at 14 Clover Hill Road, the court upheld sole ownership in Marjorie Ann Haywood, née Calloway, as established by the deed of inheritance. The marital contribution doctrine, the court found, was inapplicable given the nature of the inheritance, the absence of Randy's name from the deed at the time of transfer, which had been a knowing decision, documented by the estate attorney's records, and the fact that no joint financial contributions to the property's mortgage had been made, as the house had been inherited free and clear. Randy Haywood had no legal claim to the property. None. On the matter of the marital assets, the court noted the pattern of financial transfers. $22,000 diverted from joint accounts and a joint collateralized equity line to accounts associated with Tammy Briggs over an 18-month period. This constituted dissipation of marital assets. In compensating for this dissipation, the court awarded Marjorie Haywood a greater share of the liquid marital estate than would otherwise have been standard. The investment account, 20 years of careful saving, $31,000, was awarded to me in full. On the matter of the forged signature, the court noted that this matter had been referred to the district attorney and declined to adjudicate it separately. But the judge's written opinion included language I will not soon forget. She wrote that the court found evidence of a pattern of deliberate deception and financial manipulation by the respondent that significantly undermined the foundational trust of the marital relationship. That was in a legal document, on the record, permanently. Randy's attorney filed a notice of intent to appeal on 2 minor procedural grounds. Ellen reviewed it and told me, calmly, that the grounds were thin and that she expected the appeal to go nowhere. She was right. It was dismissed 4 months later without a hearing. When I walked out of that courthouse on a gray December afternoon, the cold hit me immediately. The particular cold of Tennessee in winter, dry and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in for a moment. The same steps I had driven past hundreds of times without ever having occasion to walk up. Caroline was waiting on the sidewalk below. She had taken the day off work to be there, though she hadn't been permitted in the courtroom. When she saw my face, she understood. She came up the steps and hugged me, and I let her. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," I said. We stood there together on the courthouse steps for a moment, my daughter and I. In the December cold, in the town I had lived in my whole life, in the state my parents had raised me in. The dogwood in my backyard would bloom again in April. My mother's china was in its cabinet. My father's handwriting was on the pantry wall. Randy, I learned later through channels I won't detail, had left the courthouse that afternoon a shaken man. Walters had been professional about informing him of what the ruling meant for the divorce, for the ongoing district attorney's matter regarding the forged signature, for the financial reality of his position going forward. Randy had left the marriage with his truck, his fishing gear, his personal belongings, and a share of the joint accounts diminished by the court's finding of dissipation. He had walked into a courthouse expecting to emerge with a house and a girlfriend, and a clean start. He walked out with none of it. I will not say I felt no satisfaction. I am human. But the dominant feeling, sitting in Ellen's office afterward for a brief debrief, was not triumph. It was something quieter, an exhale. The specific feeling of a thing having been settled correctly, of a wrong that had been named and documented and addressed according to the rules that exist for exactly that purpose. The world had worked the way it was supposed to work. "You were very well prepared," Ellen said. "I was organized," I said. "In this work," she said, "they're often the same thing." I went home to Clover Hill Road that evening. I made myself dinner. I sat in my mother's armchair. I looked out the window at the winter yard, at the bare dogwood against the gray sky. I was 68 years old, alone in a house I owned, in possession of my full legal rights and most of my retirement savings, with a daughter who loved me and a community that had shown up. It was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came to Millbrook the way it always does. The redbuds first, and then the dogwood. My mother's dogwood bloomed in April exactly as it always had, white and unhurried and absolute. I spent the winter reacquainting myself with my own life. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I repainted the guest room a color called Quiet Fog, which I had wanted for 3 years and which Randy had found too gray. I joined a morning walking group that met at 6:30 at the park. 8 women between 55 and 78, including Ruth from First Methodist and Dolores, who walked slower than anyone but talked the most. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, which I had thought about and not done for 15 years. I was not talented. I found, to my genuine surprise, that this did not matter. My finances, settled by the court, were stable. The house was mine outright. My cardiologist reported at my February checkup that my blood pressure had come down to normal. I thought the accurate explanation was that I had stopped living with a sustained, low-level threat I hadn't fully recognized for what it was. Caroline and Tom came for Easter. The grandchildren ran in the yard. I made the ham the way Mama used to, and we sat at my table with my mother's tablecloth, and I looked around at the people I had made, and something in me settled like a foundation being poured. Dolores kept me informed of Randy. He had moved in with a cousin in Gallatin, 30 miles away. The district attorney's inquiry into the forged signature had proceeded, and the uncertainty of it hung over him. I did not wish him prosecution specifically. I wished accuracy. The DA's office was being accurate. Tammy Briggs fared poorly in a way that owed nothing to me and everything to her own choices. The relationship with Randy had collapsed under the weight of what their shared future actually contained. A man with no house, diminished assets, and a pending legal matter. By summer, she had moved back to the county she'd come from. She was not mentioned around Millbrook anymore. What I felt when Dolores told me was something close to nothing. The absence of concern rather than the presence of satisfaction. They had made choices. The world had accounted for them. What I enjoyed, genuinely and daily, was the texture of my own life. The morning walk, the coffee after, the watercolor class, Helen from next door, a friendship that had finally, late in both our lives, become what it should have been years ago. The house on Clover Hill Road had always been mine. But that summer, for the first time, it felt entirely like home. Not the home I had shared with someone else, but mine. The place I had chosen, through difficulty and clarity, to return to and inhabit fully. My cardiologist was pleased with my numbers. My daughter called every morning. The dogwood would bloom again in April. People thought that at 68, I was finished. Randy thought I was too old and too frightened to fight. He was wrong on both counts. What I learned is this: know what is yours. Know it legally, know it completely, and document everything. Silence is not weakness. Preparation is not aggression. And the law, when you meet it properly, exists to protect exactly the people it was built for. What would you have done standing on that porch with your suitcases at your feet? I'd love to know. Leave your thoughts below. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. My son wrote, "Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own life and family." I said nothing and silently rewrote my will. The next morning, he burst into my house and, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Whitfield, and I am 71 years old. I have lived in the same house on Clover Creek Road for 38 years. The white colonial with the green shutters and the rose bushes. My late husband, Gerald, planted the spring before he died. People on our street knew that house. They knew me. They knew the smell of my apple pie drifting through the screen door on Sunday afternoons, and they knew the sound of my wind chimes when the Tennessee breeze came through in October. That house was not just a building. It was the proof that I had lived, that I had loved, that I had survived. Gerald died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 14 weeks from diagnosis to the last breath. After that, it was just me and the memory of everything we had built together, the savings, the property, the small rental house on Birchwood Avenue that Gerald had purchased as an investment in 1998. We had no daughters. We had one son, Daniel. For a long time, I told myself that Daniel was a good man who had simply become busy. That is what mothers do. We translate neglect into busyness, indifference into stress, coldness into exhaustion. Daniel was 44 years old, worked in commercial real estate in Nashville, and had been married for 9 years to a woman named Tara. Tara was polished in the way that certain women are polished. Smooth surface, no warmth underneath. She wore expensive blouses and spoke about money the way other people speak about the weather. Constantly, casually, as though it required no particular sensitivity. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, Mason, 7, and Lily, 5. I adored those children, and that adoration, I would later understand, was used against me like a key in a lock. The first thing that should have warned me happened 2 Christmases ago. I had prepared the house for the holiday, the tree, the stockings, the dinner that took me 2 days to cook. Daniel and Tara arrived 3 hours late. Tara walked through the front door, glanced around the living room, and said, without lowering her voice, "Daniel, we really need to talk about this house. The upkeep alone must be costing her a fortune." She said it as though I were not standing 4 feet away, as though I were already gone. I said nothing. I served the dinner. I watched Tara cut Lily's turkey and speak to Daniel in that low, deliberate way she had, the way that meant a conversation had already happened, privately, before they arrived. The second warning came in the spring. Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, unusual because Daniel rarely called without a reason attached to it, and asked very casually whether I had ever considered a reverse mortgage on Clover Creek Road. I asked him why. He said he was just thinking about my financial security. I said my financial security was fine. There was a pause. Then he said, "Mom, you should be realistic about the future." I told him I was very realistic. We hung up. After that call, I began to notice things I had previously explained away. The way Tara always steered conversations toward the rental property on Birchwood Avenue. The questions about my will, never direct, always wrapped in concern. "Have you updated your documents, Mom? You really should have everything in order." The way Daniel began to visit more frequently that summer, but each visit felt less like a son checking on his mother and more like an inspection. I was not a foolish woman. I had taught high school English for 26 years. I had read enough literature to recognize the shape of a story while it was still forming. But I still was not prepared for what came in September. It was a Sunday evening. The light was going amber through the kitchen window, the way it does in Tennessee in early fall. I had made soup, chicken, and wild rice. And Daniel had come over alone, without Tara or the children. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a few minutes, it felt almost like it used to. Like he was still just my son. Then he put down his spoon. He looked at me across the table, and his face changed. Not into cruelty, exactly, but into something harder, something decided. And he said the words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Mom, I need you to understand something. Don't you dare count on me in your old age. I have my own life. I have my own family. What happens to you is not my responsibility." The kitchen was very quiet. The soup was still warm. Outside, a car passed slowly on Clover Creek Road. I did not answer him. I looked at my son, at the face I had held in my hands the day he was born, and I said nothing at all. I simply nodded, once, and looked back down at my bowl. He left 20 minutes later, seemingly satisfied that he had handled something efficiently. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sat alone at my kitchen table until the soup went cold. That night, I slept very little. But by morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I woke at 5:15 that Monday morning to the sound of the mockingbird that lived in the oak tree by the back fence. Gerald had loved that bird. He used to say it was the most honest creature in the neighborhood because it never pretended to be only one thing. I lay still in bed for a long while, looking at the ceiling. My chest felt heavy, not from grief exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of finally seeing something clearly that you had been avoiding for a very long time. I thought about money first, because money was what this was actually about. Gerald had left everything to me, and everything was not insignificant. The house on Clover Creek Road had been appraised the previous year at $412,000. The rental property on Birchwood Avenue brought in $1,400 a month and was valued at around $220,000. My savings, the combined result of Gerald's life insurance, 30 years of careful living, and my own teacher's pension, sat in accounts totaling just over $180,000. I also had Gerald's old truck, my own car, and the contents of a house filled with 38 years of accumulated life. In total, I was sitting on assets worth close to $800,000. And my son had just told me, to my face, at my kitchen table, that I was not his responsibility. I got up, made coffee, and sat in Gerald's chair by the front window. The wingback armchair he had reupholstered himself the year before he got sick. I held my mug with both hands, and I did what I had always done when I needed to think clearly. I made a list in my head. What did I fear? I feared incapacity. I feared a future in which I was vulnerable and dependent on a man who had just declared himself indifferent to that vulnerability. I feared Tara, her cold arithmetic, her way of looking at this house like it was already an asset to be liquidated. I feared that if I did nothing, I would spend the last years of my life slowly transferring everything I had worked for into the hands of people who had already decided I was a burden before I had even become one. What did I know for certain? I knew that my current will, drawn up 8 years ago, left the entirety of my estate to Daniel. I knew that I had never questioned this, because 8 years ago I had still believed he was the son I thought I had raised. I knew that a will is not a promise. It is a document, and documents can be changed. What could I do? I could do quite a lot, actually. The first thing I decided, sitting in Gerald's chair with the morning light coming pale through the curtains, was that I would call my attorney. His name was Warren Holt, and he had handled Gerald's estate and drawn up my original will. He was 70 years old, semi-retired, absolutely trustworthy, and he had known me for 15 years. I would call Warren, and I would ask him to review my options. The second thing I decided was that I would not tell Daniel. Not yet. Not until everything was in order and there was nothing left to argue about. The third thing, and this one came to me slowly, like something surfacing from deep water, was that I would not simply rewrite my will to exclude Daniel and leave it blank. I would rewrite it with intention. I would think carefully about who deserved what I had built, and I would make choices that reflected my actual values, not the obligation I had simply inherited by being someone's mother. I thought about the people in my life who had shown up without being asked. My neighbor Dorothy, who had brought groceries to my door during the worst week of my grief after Gerald died, and never once mentioned it again. My former student James, who had grown up to work with a local literacy nonprofit, and who called me every few months just to say hello and to tell me which books he was reading. My church, which ran a food pantry every Thursday morning and never seemed to have quite enough. My niece Claire, Gerald's sister's daughter, who was 37, raising 2 kids alone after a divorce, working as a nurse, and who had sent me a handwritten birthday card every single year without fail. These people existed. They were real, and they had never once looked at me and calculated my net worth. By 8 o'clock that morning, I had finished my coffee and my thinking. I was not hysterical. I was not bitter in the burning, poisonous way. I was something quieter and more durable than that. I was decided. I picked up the phone and called Warren Holt's office. His assistant, a cheerful young woman named Patrice, told me Warren had an opening Thursday at 2 o'clock. I said Thursday at 2 was perfect. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and began for the first time in months to feel something that surprised me with its steadiness. I felt calm. Thursday came with the kind of steady gray sky that Tennessee sometimes produces in September. Not threatening, just settled, as though the weather itself had made a decision and was sticking to it. I dressed carefully. Not formally. I was not going to court. But with the quiet intention of a woman who wants to be taken seriously. Dark slacks, my good cream blouse, the small pearl earrings Gerald had given me for our 25th anniversary. Warren Holt's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Commerce Street in downtown Franklin. The waiting area smelled of old paper and coffee, which I had always found reassuring. Patrice waved me in at 2 o'clock exactly. Warren was a broad, slow-moving man with white hair and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades listening to families in distress without letting their distress become his own. He stood when I entered, shook my hand with both of his, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Margaret," he said, "it's good to see you, though I suspect this isn't a social call." "It isn't," I said, and I told him everything. I told him about the reverse mortgage question in the spring, about Tara's comments at Christmas, about the escalating pattern of inquiries about my estate, and I told him, plainly and without drama, exactly what Daniel had said to me at the kitchen table 9 days ago. Warren listened without interrupting. He took 1 or 2 notes. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as unsurprised. "You have every right to restructure your estate plan however you see fit," he said. "In Tennessee, you are under no legal obligation to leave anything to an adult child. Your assets are yours. The will reflects your wishes, and your wishes have apparently changed." "They have," I said. We spent the next 90 minutes going through my options in detail. Warren explained the mechanics clearly. What changes I could make to the will itself, what assets I might want to place in a living trust to ensure they transferred outside of probate, whether I should consider naming a non-family executor to remove any potential for contestation. He was thorough and unhurried, and when we were finished, I had a clear picture of what the next steps would look like. I left his office at 3:40 with a folder of notes and an appointment to return the following Tuesday to sign revised documents. On the drive home, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 20 minutes later when I was pulling into my driveway. I let that one go as well. The messages I listened to inside the house with my coat still on. The first message was casual, almost artificially so. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Give me a call when you get a chance." The second was less casual. "Mom, I ran into Warren Holt's assistant today at the coffee shop on 5th. Patrice, she mentioned you had an appointment. Is everything okay? Call me." I stood in my hallway and replayed that second message twice. Franklin was a small town. That was simply true, and I could not hold it against Patrice for making innocent conversation. But Daniel's reaction to the information, the speed of it, the second call, the careful phrasing, told me something important. It told me that he understood immediately what a visit to an estate attorney might mean, which meant he had been thinking about my estate all along. I did not call him back. But the next morning, something happened that turned suspicion into evidence. I had given Daniel a spare key to my house years ago for emergencies. I had never thought twice about it. That Friday morning, I left the house at 9 to have breakfast with Dorothy at the diner on Main, and I returned at 11 to find something wrong in my study. Nothing was missing, but things had been moved. My filing cabinet, the gray two-drawer one where I kept financial documents, insurance papers, Gerald's old tax returns, was not fully closed. The bottom drawer had a faint gap, and inside, I could see that the hanging folders were slightly disturbed, as though someone had gone through them quickly and not quite replaced them in the right order. I stood in the doorway of my study and looked at those files for a long time. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I walked to the kitchen, sat down, and thought about what this meant. Someone had been in my house while I was at breakfast. Someone who had a key. Someone who, after hearing I had visited an estate attorney, had decided they needed to know more. Specifically, what documents I kept. Perhaps what my current will said. Perhaps what my accounts contained. The point of no return, people call it. The moment when you understand that what you feared is not paranoia, but reality. This was that moment. I called Warren that afternoon and told him to make the new documents his absolute priority. I also asked him quietly whether I should change my locks. Yes, he said without hesitation. Change your locks. I called a locksmith before I hung up with Warren. The new locks were installed by 4 o'clock that Friday afternoon. I put Daniel's old key in a kitchen drawer underneath the dish towels, and I did not touch it again. Tuesday came. I drove back to Warren's office on Commerce Street with the quiet focus of someone completing a task they have already fully decided upon. There was no drama in it for me by then. No trembling hands. No tearful second-guessing. I had spent the weekend in a state of unusual stillness, going about my ordinary routines with the particular peace that comes when a long internal argument has finally reached its conclusion. Warren had the revised documents prepared. We went through them together, carefully, line by line, because Warren was that kind of attorney, the kind who made sure you understood what you were signing, not just that you were signing it. The new will left the house on Clover Creek Road and its contents to my niece Claire, with the provision that she could sell or occupy as she chose. The rental property on Birchwood Avenue I placed in a living trust, with the income designated to support the local literacy nonprofit where James volunteered and directed. A bequest structured so that it would operate for a minimum of 15 years before the principal could be touched. My savings were divided. A substantial portion to Claire outright, a meaningful gift to Dorothy, and the remainder to my church's food pantry endowment fund. Daniel received nothing. That was not an accident or an oversight. It was a decision, and it was documented as such. I also named Warren himself as executor, removing any family member from that role entirely. I signed everything at 2:17 in the afternoon. Warren witnessed it. Patrice notarized it. The documents went into Warren's safe. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. The call came that evening at 7:15. It was Tara, not Daniel. Tara. Which told me something right away about who was actually managing this situation. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge underneath it, like a table with one leg slightly shorter than the others. She said she and Daniel were concerned about me. She said they had heard I had been meeting with an attorney, and they were worried I might be making decisions that I would regret. She said, and I noted the exact phrasing, that any changes I made to my estate planning could create serious complications for the family going forward. I let her finish. Then I said calmly, "Tara, I appreciate your concern. My legal affairs are in order. Good night." I ended the call. 20 minutes later, Daniel called. His tone was different from Tara's. Less polished, more pressured, the way he used to sound when he was a teenager who had done something wrong and was trying to argue his way out of it. He said he needed to come over and talk. I said that wasn't necessary. He said he was worried about my mental state. I said my mental state was excellent. He said that elderly people sometimes made financial decisions that didn't reflect their true intentions, and that he was only trying to protect me. I recognized this immediately for what it was: the beginning of a narrative, a story being constructed about my competence. And I felt the first cold edge of genuine alarm. But I did not let him hear it. "Daniel," I said, "I am 71 years old and I taught English for 26 years. I understand language very well, including the language people use when they are trying to build a case. Don't call me again tonight." And I hung up. The next morning, Daniel arrived at my door at 8:45. He knocked. I did not answer. He tried his key and found, of course, that it no longer worked. He knocked again, louder. I stood in my hallway, 6 feet from the door, and did not move. "Mom?" His voice through the door was tight. "Mom, I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk." I said, clearly and loudly enough for him to hear, "If you have something to say to me, you can call Warren Holt. He is my attorney and my executor. Good morning, Daniel." There was a long silence. Then I heard his footsteps on the porch, and then the sound of his car starting and pulling away. I stood in the hallway for a moment after he left, and I noticed that my heart was beating faster than normal. That was honest. That was real. He was still my son, and standing 4 feet away from his voice while refusing to open the door was not a small thing. But I had done it. I called Dorothy that afternoon and asked if I could come for dinner. She said, of course, immediately, without asking why, which was one of the 10,000 reasons I loved her. I spent the evening at her kitchen table eating roast chicken and talking about her garden and her grandchildren and a novel she had just finished. And by the time I drove home that night, I felt like myself again. I gave myself the rest of the week. I read. I tended my rose bushes. I sat in Gerald's chair in the mornings. I let myself be quiet for a few days before whatever came next. The following week on a Wednesday, I received a card in the mail. A card? Not an email, not a text, but an actual card in a cream-colored envelope, addressed in Tara's handwriting. The front had a photograph of autumn leaves. Inside, in Tara's neat, controlled script, it read, "We have been thinking about you and we miss you. We would love to take you to dinner this weekend, just the 4 of us, you, Daniel, and the children. Lily has been asking for her grandmother. We hope you'll let us make things right. With love, Tara and Daniel." I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. Lily asking for her grandmother. I want you to understand what that sentence was designed to do. It was designed to locate the one pressure point that I had not yet fully armored: my grandchildren. Mason and Lily were not responsible for any of this. They were 7 and 5 years old. They were innocent of everything. And Tara knew, she had always known, that they were the door through which I could be moved. I thought about Lily's face, her gap-toothed smile, the way she called me Grammy Maggie and insisted on sitting in my lap even when she was technically too big for it. I sat with that feeling for a long while. I did not push it away or pretend it wasn't there. That would have been dishonest, and I had decided some time ago that I was going to be honest with myself about everything from this point forward. Then I thought about something Warren had said to me in our first meeting. "Margaret, people who have decided you owe them something will use whatever door you leave open." The card went into the recycling bin. I did not call, I did not write back, I did not accept the dinner invitation. 2 days later, Daniel texted me directly. The message was longer this time, and it had shifted register. Instead of pressure, it offered apology. He said he had spoken harshly. He said he was under a lot of stress at work. He said he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, and that, of course, he cared about me. He said he would like to come over, alone, just to talk, just the two of them. No agenda. No agenda. I had been a teacher for 26 years. I knew what it meant when someone told you there was no agenda. It meant there was very much an agenda. I replied with 4 words. I'll be in touch. I was not in touch. What I did instead was this. I called James. James Cooper was 39 now. And when I had taught him sophomore English at Franklin High, he had been a quiet boy who read everything and said very little in class, but left essays on my desk that I still thought about decades later. We had stayed loosely connected over the years, occasional emails, those phone calls every few months. I called him that Thursday and asked if I could come see the literacy center where he worked. He said he'd love that. He said Friday morning was perfect. The center was on a side street downtown, 3 rooms in a converted storefront with a small library, a reading corner for children, and a volunteer tutoring program for adults who were working toward their GED. James gave me a tour with the quiet pride of someone who has built something real and knows it. We had coffee afterward in the little office in the back, and I told him, not everything, not the legal specifics, but the shape of it, that I was making some changes to how I wanted my assets to be used after I was gone, and that his organization was part of those plans. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Miss Margaret, you don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," I said. "That's why I want to." He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't become overwhelmed or effusive. He just nodded and said thank you, in the way that people say thank you when they mean it entirely. And that was enough. On the way home, I stopped at Claire's apartment. She was between shifts at the hospital, still in her scrubs, feeding her 2 kids, Owen, 9, and Sophie, 6. A very rushed lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches. I sat at her small kitchen table and watched the ordinary chaos of her afternoon. And when the children had run off to do whatever children run off to do, I told Claire, carefully and plainly, that I had revised my estate documents and that she should know she was in them. Claire put down her coffee cup and looked at me. "Aunt Margaret, I don't want a conversation about it," I said. "I just wanted you to know. You've always shown up. That matters." Her eyes filled. She didn't say much more than thank you, and I told her she was welcome, and we talked about Owen's soccer team for 20 minutes, which was exactly the right thing to do. I drove home on the back roads through the gold and rust October countryside, and I thought, this is what I am protecting. This ordinary, imperfect, real life. Not some imagined future, not the performance of family, the actual thing. And I was not going to surrender it. They came on a Saturday morning, 9 days after the card. I was in the backyard with my coffee and my gardening gloves, cutting back the rose bushes for the autumn, when I heard the car in the driveway. I knew the sound of Daniel's car the way you know certain sounds that have been part of your life for decades. The particular engine note, the way the door closed with slightly more force than necessary. I set down my shears and waited. Daniel came around the side of the house with Mason and Lily. He had brought the children. Of course he had. Lily ran to me immediately, arms out, and I held her. I want to be clear about this. I held her completely. I let myself feel how much I loved her, because that was the truth, and pretending otherwise would have made me smaller, not stronger. Mason hung back a little in the way that boys his age do, trying to seem casual, but he allowed me to hug him too, and he squeezed back harder than he probably intended. Daniel stood watching this with an expression I recognized. Calculated tenderness. the expression of a man who has placed his children between himself and a consequence. "Mom," he said, "can we come in?" I looked at him over Lily's head. "The children can come in," I said. "We can talk out here." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. I brought the children inside and settled them in the living room with the basket of old picture books and puzzles I kept for their visits. Then I came back outside. Tara was standing by the garden gate now. She had been in the car, I realized, letting Daniel lead the approach. She was dressed carefully, as always. A dove-gray jacket, her hair smooth. She came forward when she saw me, and her face arranged itself into an expression of gentle concern. "Margaret," she said. She never called me Mom. I had noticed that early in the marriage. "We've been so worried. We feel terrible about how things have gotten. We just want to talk, honestly, as a family." "All right," I said. I did not sit down. I stood near the rose bushes with my gardening gloves still in my hand. What followed was approximately 40 minutes of the most artful manipulation I have ever personally witnessed, and I have read a great deal of literature. Tara spoke first and longest. She acknowledged that Daniel had said something hurtful. She framed it as a moment of weakness under stress. His firm had been going through restructuring, she explained, and he had been carrying a great deal of pressure that he hadn't known how to express. She said that of course they intended to be there for me as I got older, that family was everything to them, that none of this reflected how they truly felt. Her voice was warm, her hands were folded, her eyes were steady. It was, I thought, an excellent performance. Then she shifted, almost imperceptibly, to the point of the visit. She said she understood I had met with my attorney recently, and she said she hoped I hadn't made any, her word, drastic decisions under emotional distress. She said that estate planning done in a moment of pain sometimes created complications that couldn't be undone. She said that she and Daniel only wanted to make sure I had thought everything through clearly, with a full picture of what my choices might mean for the family. There it was. Daniel nodded along to everything Tara said, with the earnest agreement of a man who has been thoroughly briefed. And then he added something of his own, something that struck me as more genuinely felt than anything Tara had scripted. He said he remembered how hard I had worked my whole life. He said he remembered sitting at that same kitchen table as a boy, watching me grade papers late into the night. He said he didn't want to see everything I had built go to strangers. I looked at him for a long moment. There was, somewhere deep in that speech, a real son. I could hear him in there, behind the argument. That was the most painful part of the whole 40 minutes. Not Tara's performance, but Daniel's accidental sincerity. It would have been easier if there had been nothing left to grieve, but grief and resolution are not mutually exclusive. I had learned that much. "Daniel," I said quietly, "the people I have chosen are not strangers. They are people who showed up. The distinction matters." He looked away. Tara, sensing the moment was slipping, tried a final approach. She mentioned, with careful casualness, that Bradley Foss, their attorney, had advised them that certain estate changes made under demonstrable emotional distress could potentially be revisited. She said she wasn't threatening anything. She just wanted me to understand my options. I let the silence sit for a beat after she finished. "Tara," I said, "you have given a very thoughtful speech. I want to acknowledge that." She started to say something, but I continued. "My decisions are made. They are legal, they are final, and they have been witnessed and notarized. My attorney is aware of the full context of why they were made, including the conversation at this kitchen table in September. If you have concerns about my mental competency, you're welcome to pursue that legally. Warren will be able to advise you on how likely that is to succeed." I paused. Is there anything else? Tara's composure did not shatter, but it cracked. A small, visible cracking, like a plate that has been dropped and not yet broken. Her smile went slightly wrong at the edges, Daniel said, his voice strained. Mom, you are making a serious mistake. I've made my assessment, I said. Thank you both for coming. I went inside. I gathered Lily and Mason, held them each for an extra moment, and watched from the doorway as Daniel buckled them into the car. Tara walked to the passenger side without looking back at me. The car backed out of the driveway and was gone. I stood in my hallway alone, and I noticed something. My hands were trembling slightly. Not from weakness, I want to be precise about that, but from the particular physical aftermath of sustained tension, the body releasing what the mind had been holding still. And underneath the trembling was something else. A deep, clear, almost mineral steadiness. The fear was real, but it was not larger than my resolve. It was smaller. 2 weeks after that Saturday, Warren Holt called me. Margaret, he said, I've received a letter from an attorney named Bradley Foss, representing your son Daniel and his wife. They are requesting access to your recent estate documents on the grounds that they have concerns about your testamentary capacity, meaning your ability to make legally sound decisions. They're suggesting that your revisions were made under psychological duress and may not reflect your genuine intentions. I was sitting in Gerald's chair. I looked at the morning light on the far wall for a moment. What do you need from me? I said. I'd like you to come in, Warren said, and I'd suggest we also arrange for a brief cognitive assessment with your physician, Dr. Harmon, as a precautionary measure. It's standard practice when capacity is questioned, and having a clean assessment on record will preemptively close this door. I'll call Dr. Harmon today, I said. I saw Dr. Harmon 2 days later. The cognitive assessment took 45 minutes. It was not particularly difficult. Memory exercises, sequential reasoning, a brief, structured interview. Dr. Harmon, who had been my doctor for 16 years, administered it with a professional neutrality that I appreciated, and then told me at the end that my results were excellent and that she would provide written documentation to Warren. She also said quietly before I left, Margaret, for what it's worth, you seem to me like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. I do, I said. The following Thursday, Warren had arranged a meeting. In his conference room, me, Warren, and, on the other side of the table, Daniel, Tara, and their attorney, Bradley Foss. Foss was a youngish man in an expensive suit who had clearly been well briefed and was working to project authority. Daniel was in a dark jacket and looked, I noticed, tired, in a way that went beyond a bad night's sleep. Tired in the way people look when they have been running a story that is starting to cost them more than they expected. Tara was impeccable, as always. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different from the woman who had stood in my garden 2 weeks earlier. Tighter, less certain of the ground. Warren opened by presenting the documentation, the signed will, the notarized trust documents, the certificate of independent legal counsel, and Dr. Harmon's written assessment of full testamentary capacity. He placed each item on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone laying cards, and he let the room understand what it was looking at. Foss began his counter-argument. He raised the question of emotional pressure, of hasty decisions, of potential undue influence from third parties. Here, he glanced obliquely at the mention of James and the literacy nonprofit in the documents, as though a bequest to charity were evidence of manipulation. He used careful, measured language, the language of a man building something slowly. But every point he raised, Warren had anticipated. The preparation had been thorough, and it showed. Warren dismantled each point methodically. I said very little. I had decided before arriving that I would let the documents speak and Warren argue, and that I would speak only when there was something important to add. So I sat with my hands folded on the table and I watched the room. What I watched most carefully was Tara. She had been quiet for the first 30 minutes, and her silence was doing a kind of work. She was the still point in the room, composed, waiting. I recognized the tactic because I had seen it in my classroom for 26 years. The student who says nothing and lets others speak, conserving their moment. She was waiting for the argument to open a door she could walk through. It was Foss's stumble that gave her the opening. When Warren produced the timeline of my attorney visits alongside the locksmith invoice, Foss fumbled briefly trying to contextualize it, and in that small gap, Tara leaned forward. She said, with an edge in her voice that she could no longer entirely contain, "Margaret, we know you met with your attorney the same week you got the appraisal on Birchwood done. Don't you think that looks like this was planned?" The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just been said. Warren looked at Tara. Foss looked at Tara. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not dramatically, just a single slow blink, the expression of a man who has just watched something he cannot take back. Because the appraisal on Birchwood Avenue had been done privately through a firm I had contacted on my own, communicated only to my personal cell phone. I had told no one. There was no way to know about it unless someone had gone through my files. I looked at Tara calmly. "How do you know about the Birchwood appraisal?" I said. Her expression flickered. "Daniel must have mentioned." "Daniel didn't know," I said. "I hadn't told anyone. The appraisal company contacted me directly at my personal number. There was nothing in writing at the house except the appraisal document itself, in the filing cabinet in my study." I let that land. "The filing cabinet," I added. "That was not fully closed when I returned home from breakfast on the morning of September 26th. The silence in Warren's conference room was of the kind that has weight and texture. Foss put a hand on Tara's arm, slightly too quickly. A lawyer's instinct, stopping a witness from continuing. Daniel was looking at the table with the fixed attention of a man who has discovered that the floor is less solid than he believed. Tara said nothing more. The performance was over. What was left in her place was something stripped of its finish, defensive, cornered, small in the way that people who have operated through manipulation become small when the manipulation stops working. For the first time since I had known her, Tara looked her actual age. Warren said, in a tone of absolute composure, "Margaret, would you like to note for the record that this exchange confirms unauthorized access to your private documents, consistent with the filing cabinet incident and the changed locks you reported to me in September?" "Yes," I said. "I would like that noted." Foss called for a brief recess. He spent 4 minutes in the hallway with Daniel and Tara. When they came back, his manner had changed entirely. The architecture of authority he had walked in with was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of a man managing a retreat. He said they would be withdrawing the challenge to testamentary capacity. He said his clients wished to resolve the matter privately. I said there was nothing left to resolve. I gathered my things, thanked Warren, and walked out of that conference room into a clear October afternoon with the firm and final knowledge that the hardest part was over. Warren followed up with a formal written response to Bradley Foss's firm that same afternoon, citing the complete documentation and noting explicitly that any further attempts to challenge the will on capacity grounds would be met with a full accounting of the September break-in, including the disturbed filing cabinet and the timeline confirming Daniel had a key. The letter was precise, factual, and absolute in its implications without being theatrical. That was Warren's particular gift. Bradley Foss did not respond. The challenge was officially withdrawn in writing 3 days later. I will be honest. I waited for some secondary consequence, another approach, another strategy. People who have operated through pressure rarely give up cleanly. But in the days that followed, the silence from Daniel and Tara was complete. I understood why. They had exposed themselves in that conference room in a way that could not be undone. Tara's knowledge of the Birchwood appraisal had confirmed the break-in as clearly as a fingerprint. Pursuing the matter further would have meant inviting scrutiny they could not afford. Daniel called me once, about 2 weeks after the meeting. I answered because I had decided I would always answer. I was not hiding, and I had nothing to hide. His voice was flattened in a way I hadn't heard before, scraped clean of the pressure and performance of the previous months. He said he didn't want to argue. He said he understood things had changed. He said he hoped I was all right. I told him I was well. I asked after Mason and Lily. He said they were fine. There was a pause that lasted several seconds and contained, I thought, a great deal that neither of us said. Then he said, "I said something terrible to you." I waited. "I'm not sure I can explain it," he said. "I'm not sure there's an explanation that makes it okay." "There isn't," I said, "but I appreciate you saying so." We did not make plans. We did not suddenly reconcile into the family we had never quite been. That would have been fiction, and I was living my life, not writing it. What we had, after that call, was a kind of honest distance. Not warmth, but not warfare either. A permanent alteration in the landscape acknowledged by both of us. The legal matters resolved themselves quietly after that. The Living Trust for the Literacy nonprofit was formally established in November, with James named as the organizational contact. Warren finalized the transfer of the Birchwood deed into the trust structure. Claire received formal notification of her place in the will and called me, briefly and quietly, to say thank you, and to say she hoped I would live to be 102 and that the whole thing would be entirely irrelevant for decades. I told her I intended to try. What I had not entirely anticipated was the reaction of people outside the immediate family. Word travels in a small town. Not the specific legal details, those stayed private, but the general shape of what had happened. That Margaret Whitfield had revised her estate plan and stood her ground against family pressure. Dorothy knew most of it because I had told her. James knew his portion. Several people at my church had heard something, though the details blurred in the retelling, as they always do. What I found, unexpectedly, was that people wanted to talk about it. Not in a gossipy way, but in the way that people reach towards stories that reflect something they have been thinking about privately. 3 women from my church, women I had known for years, women in their 60s and 70s, took me to lunch in November and said, in various gentle ways, that they were thinking about their own situations, their own documents, their own unexamined assumptions about what family meant and what obligation looked like. I told them what Warren had told me, that a will is not a promise and not a punishment. It is simply a document, and the only meaningful question about it is whether it accurately reflects your values. The lunch lasted 3 hours. We talked about our lives, the real shape of our lives, not the performed versions. By the end of it, I felt, as I had not felt in years, fully seen. That autumn, I also made an appointment with a local family mediator. Not because there was conflict left to mediate, but because I wanted to establish a formal, limited framework for maintaining my relationship with Mason and Lily. I was not willing to lose my grandchildren over the failures of their parents, and I was not willing to use them as leverage in the opposite direction. The mediator helped me draft a simple letter to Daniel, proposing quarterly visits, structured, neutral, conducted in a way that served the children first. Daniel agreed after a week's silence, without negotiation. The first visit was in December. We went to the botanical garden. Mason found a praying mantis on a bench and spent 20 minutes studying it with the focused attention of a boy who might become a scientist. Lily held my hand and told me, unprompted, that Grammy Maggie smelled like flowers. I did not cry until I was in the car driving home, but they were the right kind of tears. Life, after a storm, does not return to what it was. It settles into a new shape, different, sometimes better, always more honest about its own outlines. The following year was the first in a long while that I lived on my own terms, entirely. I started volunteering at the Literacy Center on Thursday mornings. James had mentioned gently that they always needed readers for the children's program, and I had shown up one Thursday in January, mostly out of curiosity, and never stopped. There was a small boy named Elijah, 6 years old, who hadn't yet found the book that would open the door. I found it for him, a battered copy of Charlotte's Web that had been on the center's shelf for 10 years. The day he finished it, he sat very still for a moment, then looked up at me and said, "Is that what happens when you love something?" I told him yes, that was exactly what happened. I traveled that year too, something I had not done since Gerald died. Dorothy's daughter lived in Portland, Oregon, and Dorothy had been talking about visiting for 2 years without ever quite going. I told her we were going in April, booked the flights, and we spent 8 days on the Oregon coast eating excellent seafood and walking on beaches that were nothing like Tennessee. I sent postcards to Claire, James, Dr. Harmon, and Warren Holt, who replied with a brief formal note saying he hoped the trip was restorative, which for Warren was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I did not send one to Daniel. That was not cruelty. It was proportion. My garden had its best year. The rose bushes Gerald had planted in 1987 bloomed in June with an abundance that startled me. Deep red, heavy-headed, almost extravagant against the white of the house. A neighbor I had barely spoken to before, a young woman named Priya, who had moved in 2 doors down with her husband and infant daughter, knocked on my door to ask the name of the variety. We ended up talking for an hour on the porch, and she began bringing the baby by on Saturday mornings. The baby's name was Nadia, and she had an expression of absolute concentrated seriousness that I found enormously funny and endearing. This is what I want you to understand about that year. It was not the year of grand events. It was the year of real ones. The distinction matters. As for Daniel and Tara, I know what happened because Franklin is small and because Claire kept me informed without making it her purpose to do so. The commercial real estate firm where Daniel worked underwent a significant restructuring in the spring. His division was reduced, and he was offered a lateral move to a smaller Memphis office or a buyout. He took the buyout. I suspect Tara's urgency about my assets had always been partly a hedge against their own financial uncertainty. They sold the house in the good neighborhood and moved to a smaller one. Tara returned to work in pharmaceutical sales. The comfortable life they had been building, the one that had apparently required a significant inheritance to sustain, became considerably more constrained. Daniel called me in the summer to tell me about the job situation. He did not ask for anything. I said I was sorry to hear it, and I meant that in the straightforward human sense. But I also sat with the knowledge that their difficulties had nothing to do with my decisions. They were the product of choices they had made, a life constructed on assumptions that had not held. They were not victims of my will. They were the product of their own. Mason and Lily came to visit in the summer, alone for the first time. Daniel dropped them off on a Friday, and I had them for the weekend. We baked. We built a birdhouse from a kit Mason had chosen. Lily lost a tooth at my kitchen table and was enormously proud of this, and we placed it carefully in a small envelope for the tooth fairy with all the solemnity the occasion required. Those 2 days were among the best I had that year. I am 72 years old now, and I live on Clover Creek Road, and the mockingbird is still in the oak tree by the back fence. In the mornings, I sit in Gerald's chair with my coffee and listen to it cycle through its repertoire: cardinal, wren, sparrow, something unnamed. And I think that Gerald was right about that bird. It is honest. It never pretends to be only one thing. I have tried, in the past year, to be the same. They say family is everything. I used to believe that without questioning it. Now I believe something more precise. Love is everything. Family is just a word for who you were born near. What I learned is this: your life, your home, your choices belong to you alone. No one is owed them simply because they share your name. If your child told you what mine told me, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have picked up the pen? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please share it. Thank you for listening.